Michelle Banks. If
Mm.
I had to describe myself, I would call myself a cultural worker. I'm not an anthropologist, so a lot of the stuff that I do falls within the realm of folklore and ethnography and anthropology. But I'm really a cultural worker, and that's a very deliberate um, identity. I think I want to say. Which comes from which comes from, and it really comes from from work that I did in the 1980s, which is the work that you are interested in talking to me about, and sort of thinking about sort of even going back, decades before that, but sort of thinking about those people who are involved in work that is meant to really elevate and support our cultural rights as well as our other rights, because I think we often don't recognize that there are other sort of smaller things within there that we really need to think about and sort of within sort of these larger contexts. So, and also I was not, I'm very much an autodidact. So I wasn't trained in anthropology or folklore and ethnography. I come to academia sort of very haphazardly. So I have had to kind of make things up as I go along, and cultural worker is I think the thing that sort of fits me the best, because there's very much sort of the art element there, but also sort of very much the element of working for social justice. Yeah.
That kind of is a good transition into the next question I have, which is just sort of like your general background in performing arts, and excuse me, also how that kind of began to overlap with social justice, like in your life.
All right. So my background is in, I guess, popular and participatory theater. And I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. And this is kind of a long, I mean, I'll do the short version of it, but it is a relevant sort of history that I'll talk about here. So I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., which when I was growing up, I was born in 1965. When I was growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and actually well into the 90s, was a predominantly Black city, also known as Chocolate City, and because of that. And the reason I mentioned that was because in the 1980s, suddenly the world came to DC. We had this very, we had a predominantly Black city with very small pockets of very upper middle class whites within the city, but a very segregated city. And then in the 1980s, the world came to DC. And what I mean by that is that there was all this turmoil happening in the world. We're coming to the end of the Cold War. The Central America wars were happening. There was conflict in various parts of, particularly East Africa and in Ethiopia. So we have all these conflicts happening in the world. And suddenly all these folks converged in Washington. And I was in high school during that period, and I was actually in a performing arts high school, which was a very I did theater. I was at a performing arts high school here in DC called Duke Ellington, where I did theater. But it was very, we had, and so you have, it was always an interesting thing. So you have these young Black teenagers coming from various and sundry economic circumstances doing Chekhov and and the very white theater. And despite the fact that I excelled in the program, I never understood what we were doing. I never understood the theater that we were doing. And just because of happenstance and serendipity and the state of the world, my closest friend in that performing high school was a refugee from El Salvador, and he was doing they had a theater group here where they were doing a very different sort of theater. Um, we became very close friends. We got involved, and when we graduated from high school, neither of us had a plan to go. I barely graduated, so I wasn't going to go to high school, going on to college. So neither of us had a plan to go to college. So we started a theater group called Latinegro, and it was this theater group that was really we came together to begin doing work to build bridges between our communities, because with what happened was is that DC was, as I mentioned, was predominantly Black, and not only that, it was also working poor for the most part. So there was, there was economically and socially, there was a lot of stuff happening here. DC at one point was the murder capital of the country. DC at one point was really kind of ground zero for what became the war on drugs. There was a lot of violence here as well. And then you have this refugee and immigrant population come in, and there were conflicts between our communities. So my friend Kike, who I was in school with from El Salvador, we decided we were going to start doing, we had trained to do theater, but we didn't quite understand the theater that we were doing because it really didn't relate to our own experiences. So we decided we would do that, start this theater group. And there used to be a theater company here in DC called Living Stage, and Bob Alexander was the director, and he was the husband of Elizabeth Alexander, who's a very accomplished actress from like the 60s and 70s, excellent, wonderful actor, Elizabeth Alexander. And she did very mainstream theater and films, but her husband Bob started this theater company that really was it was a company that really spoke to people's lives, and they did work with people who were incarcerated, and they did work with people who were houseless, and they did work with young people who were in the foster care system, and they created work that was about their experiences. So Kike and I had some experience with Living Stage. Kike had some experience that he was bringing from, well, actually, no, he discovered theater here. So we started this theater company, Latinegro, and it just so happened that DC was kind of ground zero for refugee communities from all over Latin America. And a lot of these folks were artists. And that was at least for me, that was my introduction to understanding that we have Hollywood and we have Broadway, but we also have this other very, very active and very, this very active scene of artists of folks who were using art as a way to sort of begin to address our concerns. So I mentioned the history because it is an important history as far as my own experience. So over the years, I've worked with various and sundry directors actually all of them from Latin America, and all of them were doing a teatro popular theater, and that was that work that was grounded in the work of Boal and Frere. So yeah, that's what my background is, doing this kind of work.
How has performing arts and theater educated you or changed your perspective of things like identity and culture?
I think I want to start that by saying I think that art is important labor, and I mean that very much in the Marxist sense of the word, and that our just in the same way, I use metaphors a lot, so get ready. in the same way that our bodies have to be fed, our creativity has to be fed. I think the thing that one of the things that Bob Alexander, who was the director of Living Stage, I think I heard this, and I probably heard it when I was about 16 years old. And he used to say that at the moment of creation, we are whole and perfect. And I don't even, I remember hearing that from him at the time and not really understanding it, but now understanding it like in my whole body, just sort of this understanding that at that moment of creation, we're really able to give all of ourselves, all of our identities. I think that's what I want to say. And what was interesting for me is that I come from, where I come from in the city, was very much kind of no man's land, very a segregated and very sort of isolated in some ways. And people say, oh, you don't want to be caught across the bridge in Southeast because they'll kill you over there, and that sort of thing. And there was a lot of violence. But when I was at this performing arts high school, my friend Kika, we were talking the other day, nobody ever fought. And it occurred to me that yeah, because, this is, and that's, I was sort of thinking about Bob and what he would say is that we were creating and we were able to like bring our whole selves into whatever it is that we were doing. And we were able to just be and claim all these different identities that we had. Whereas in, the other public schools that I was in, you always had to, somehow maintain some sort of facade of something that was going to keep you safe. So in terms of my own journey, in terms of my own sort of outlooks and my own sort of understanding of the world, it was that creativity that allowed me to sort of claim identity. It was that creativity that allowed me to just be in the world. I feel like it was that creativity that allowed me to be open to hearing other perspectives, to be open to hearing things that were completely foreign to my own experience. And I found that in film, I found that in literature, I found that in dance. And and I found that in the arts. So for me, I think that just going back to that quote from Bob is just that, it's that my own learning comes from my wholeness, and that wholeness is coming from that it came from my ability to be able to embrace myself as an artist at a time where I didn't have when I went to this high school, I had dropped out of high school in 9th and 10th grade at this point and wasn't even in school. So, and having that experience is that, okay, that was what the problem was. I was an artist and I wasn't surrounded by artists. So, and that was when I was able to sort of suddenly be able to claim all my different identities and be whole. Yeah.
So this is kind of a broad question. It's been a big guiding question for me in my experience in college, which is just sort of how might artistic performance be a means for navigating social justice in society?
One of the things that we would do with our performances is that it was a theater company that was supported by a youth center here in DC. And what they decided, initially we started to deal with racial tensions between Black and Brown communities here. And then little by little, we started sort of taking on like the social issues that were happening in the city, the violence that was happening in the city. There was a lot of PCP, a lot of folks smoking PCP and craziness happening. This was the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and those were sort of so we were talking about social issues, and we had this play, which sounds terrible now, but at the time it was the 1980s. What can I say? So in the 80s, there was all of this beginning of like breakdancing and freestyling and all this other business, and like sort of the beginnings of hip hop, and everything was breakdancing. If young people are going to come and they're going to breakdance, and so our first production was this play called No Breakdancing Tonight, and it was really about us sort of saying that we had this poem that we used to do where the walls and office the offices in the downtown. The offices in the downtown buildings are filled. The file cabinets in the offices in the downtown buildings are filled with paper. Everybody has a number, the reports, the statistics, the something, all this other stuff. And really sort of talking about, so y'all have all this data on us, but nothing's happening. Nothing is like, our lives are not changing. In fact, our lives are getting worse in some ways. So we would, some of our work was about calling, I think, challenging the folks who, the poverty pimps, the folks who were sort of making money off of our suffering in some ways, to be quite honest. And that included sometimes social workers, that included any number of different people who got into this work, but really you know, didn't really do much, our lives never changed. But it was also a call to, to our own peers as well, is that we have to begin to challenge, we have to begin to challenge these systems. We have to begin to sort of like let people know this is what's happening in our cities. This is what's happening to us. So that was what some of that first work looked like. It was collective creation. So our dialogues came from bus stops and, being on the bus. It's, oh shit, this morning I heard this woman on the bus and this is what she was talking about. And, or, our own sort of forays into the city, which were kind of crazy also. But so we would just come back, we'd come in with these ideas. I saw this, or I read this article. We did like a lot of newspaper theater, some of the stuff Boada was doing, where it's like, did you all see that article in the paper today? Yes, we have to talk about this. We have to create a piece about this. So one of the things that we would do is that, so we would come together and we would improvise and then from the improvisations, we would develop a script. And one of the things that we would do is in our scripts is that at a heightened moment of the performance, we would freeze it. And then we'd ask audience members, how's this end? And then we would improvise the ending. And one of the most beautiful moments of that, we did this AIDS piece, AIDS education piece. It was young hustler, drug boy, had all these different women and finds out he has AIDS, just as he finds out that he's HIV positive, just as he finds out that his live-in girlfriend is pregnant. And he decides that it's just too much. He was like thinking he was going to kill himself and then kill a girlfriend and kill himself. So we phrase it right there. And we were doing this performance with this group of very giggly and very fidgety young kids. I mean, they were not that young. I said they were probably high school students, but they were just like, whatever. And it was like the loudest sort of little knucklehead kid that was in the room. So how do we end this? He raises his hand. We're like, oh no, what's he going to say? And he says, he hears the voice of his son telling him that I want to live and we were just like, oh my God, this, we never, wouldn't expect this from this kid because, they were just like goofy, these kids. But so this idea of this heightened moment, this idea of stopping it at this heightened moment, asking our audiences, how do we end this, was really a way for us to have these discussions about these things that we didn't talk about. I feel like, at least our experience during that period, and I'm not sure if that shifted some, is that we didn't talk about this stuff. She a drug dealer, he's a drug dealer. That's who, that's what your identity was. She's an addict. That's what your identity is. And you a pariah in our communities. And having an opportunity to discuss, having an opportunity to sort of think through what the other possibilities are, even if it's on stage, that's one sort of step in that healing. We felt that was one step in that healing that needs to happen. And again, that creativity, we can't heal unless there's what we're given is very limited. In terms of this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to go to school and you're supposed to do this and this and this and this. And if you don't do those things, what else do you have? So our understanding of that, at least my understanding of that creativity is that in some cases, I just have to be more thoughtful about what I do if I don't do that. So that dialogue with the audience and that dialogue where audiences were allowed to discuss how this might change, how we might do this differently, I think was very important. So that, so for me, with the kind of work that I was doing, was what, that moving towards social justice is really allowing these, folks who haven't been able to have that conversation in a way that allows them to be whole and creative about what they might do next. That was one of the things that we were trying to do. And again, it's very similar to some of, and it's not, well, some ways in some ways similar to some of the legislative theater, legislative theater that Boal was doing. Where he was bringing in people from the favelas, and they were like creating these scenes about policy stuff. And if you bring in this group of 25 people, everybody's going to give you a different perspective about what they're seeing. And then what they would do is that they would draw up these demands and these policies. These are the things that people are saying that are happening. And unless you're there and unless you're living them, you may not be able to see those things. And those are things that they would then go back and approach mayors and neighborhood associations and that sort of thing. So in some ways it's similar to that, not exactly the same, but in some ways similar to that. But again, having that conversation my work has always been very much grassroots work. It's funny, I was having a discussion with somebody earlier today, and she was talking about movements, specifically Chicano movement and some other things that were happening in the 60s and 70s. And she wanted to know how this other piece of work had an impact. And what we were trying to explain to her was that policy is what it is. I don't really see policy changing very much at all in general, which means that we have work that we have to do in our communities. And we need to open spaces in our communities where our young people are creating. We have to open spaces in our communities that allow our young people to have these conversations and begin to reimagine what the possibilities are. And if that happens in a theater session where you stop a scene and ask them well, how do we reimagine this? Then that's how that's what it is. So I think for me, I guess I should say that really specifically, the work that I've done is really about people in communities. It's not about sort of changing policy. It's really about individuals and community, and just sort of understanding, at my age now, sort of understanding my own various, and I guess the damage that was done to me. Sort of understanding that social justice is policy, but social justice is also having an opportunity to heal our, the various and sundry damage that's been done to us. And policies don't do that. You can like open 10 schools and, whatever, and that's a policy that people want. But if I'm still damaged and still struggling through the world, then that's not going to change anything. So all that to say that for me, that creativity I guess sort of coming back full circle about some of the things I've already said, that creativity is where I think that damage that's been done to some of us begins to, where we begin to heal some of that damage.
I have really loved just Boal's methods of incorporating it into performance, and like particularly the forum theater, stopping a performance, checking in with the audience, because my work is I think has always been very provocative, and I need provocation in my work to be heard, I feel like. But I also I've found that performing in this community in Prescott College, that there is a need to sort of be mindful of who your audience is. And this has been kind of a big, inspiration for the journalist work that I'm doing, like in our community, talking about art, because, people are very easily impacted, sometimes triggered, and expecting sort of safety in a performance space. And so I guess my question is to that, how have you sort of navigated performing arts as a means of social justice with that in mind, that how to balance sort of your freedom of expression, your freedom of speech with the needs of your audience, whether that's mental health or any sort of thing like that?
There's a kind of, I guess, a sort of a discourse that I wasn't part of. And some of the newer discourse is about um, issues of safety. We were, and I don't know if it's just because I never, I've never held back. And I think people never held back on, for me in ways. So there's this part of me that, and I don't know that maybe there's some resilience there, but I don't even know if it's a healthy resilience, where like, I don't, like if I show a film and there's like something in a film that could trigger somebody, it doesn't occur to me to say, oh, trigger warning, or to stop something. I just show the film, and I don't even think about that. And that's something that I struggle with sometimes. Um, because I don't, there's this whole culture that I don't understand. And I'm trying to I'm trying to understand it, but I think that, and I understand it in the abstract, and I understand it in the sense that there are things that I wish I had never seen in my life, but I did. Um, and and there's this part of me that's like, well, I picked myself up and I kept going. I saw it, and I kept moving. So that it's kind of a conundrum for me, because I don't. Um, that's something that I don't get. And I don't mean getting it, and I hope that it doesn't sound like I'm dismissive of it. But there's this part of me that doesn't quite understand how to do that. I think that's what it is. Now that said, it's not work that I continue to do. I do some arts work. I teach photography and writing to children, and do some street theater stuff. But it's interesting. I'm writing my dissertation. I'm writing about violence. And it never occurs to me to say that, well, maybe I shouldn't write about this, because, this is, this is going to trigger somebody, or this is perhaps, people talk about like trauma porn and this other stuff. And it was interesting. We used to have these discussions. It was funny. We would have these discussions in the 80s. There was another group that we would come in. That was in the city right now, and we performed together once, like years ago. And they were like they did a lot of stuff where they would say, there was like. Coke in the pipe is wrong, and they would sing or whatever. So their whole message is that you can't do this because this is wrong. Our whole message was, somebody needs to hear this woman's story, because her story needs to be heard. And if her story is about losing her child because she was not, would leave him at home when she would go out to cop, then that's what her story is. So it's a conversation that I remember from 30 years ago. It was a little different conversation, but it is a conversation that we were having at the time. So I think that for me, I don't, I don't know. I'm not really quite sure how to navigate that as an issue, because I do think that um, um, sometimes I worry if maybe I've just put up this wall for myself. And having seen and having heard and having witnessed and having experienced all sorts of things growing up, that I'm not, I'm not quite ready to sort of recognize, or I'm not quite ready to sort of um, uh, understand that there has to be a point where we're changing, changing the approach. And and again, if I was still doing this work, then I probably would have, at some point may have thought through it in a different kind of way. And some of it also has to do with experience and perspective, I spend a lot of time in Central America, and well, I live in Guatemala, and this was a place that was devastated by conflict in the 1980s, by a genocidal conflict. And I have people saying to me when I'm in the US, it's like, oh, we don't want to see photographs of dead bodies and other things. And and in Guatemala, um, two of my partner's brothers were disappeared and murdered during the conflict in the 1980s. And a couple of times I went to exhumations of mass graves with my partner to see if we could identify his brother there. And my father-in-law would say, take photographs because I want to see what happened there. So in the US, the narrative, the larger narrative is that we won't do that. But for this other, and within sort of a different cultural context, we have a very different response. So, so again, I'm sort of, I struggle with it because I'm not sure, sometimes I'm taking cues from my family members in Guatemala, and then sometimes I'm taking cues from folks here in the US about what that safety means, and what that means, or what my own sort of need to see and understand um, um, what it means. So that, I think that's like I think for me right now, that's the best example of it, is sort of struggling with it in my own work. Sort of thinking about what people are telling me here in the US, and then thinking about what folks are saying to me in Guatemala. And they're just like, no, take a photograph. Did you take pictures? Everywhere I go, did you bring your camera? How are you taking pictures? Because they want people to see, they want people to know this is what happened here. And in here, it's a very different conversation. So anyway.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything you just said, and it's making me think of how this question kind of like crosses over to like just this question of like desensitization, with the presence of violence that's already in media throughout the world, and like particularly here too. And I'm just thinking about just like this past year with George Floyd, and how really that gave so much fuel to the Black Lives Matter movement internationally. And also then there's, kids like Kyle Rittenhouse seeing that, and, just it in a way being condoned also at the same time. So it's like, it's such a complex sort of narrative that's just so far from black and white. But yeah, I guess like, I've struggled a lot with, just this like question of like, censorship for and I guess like political correctness or cancel culture, whatever you want to call it, just like in liberal arts schools in general. And I've definitely found it here being somewhat problematic as a performer, as an artist trying to express myself, and yeah, just being mindful of like because I'm so supportive of like my peers and like my generation kind of accepting vulnerability. I think that's so important. But how do you do that without victimizing yourself even further? These have been the questions that I've had. Now that I'm in college as a performer that is kind of in the field of social justice as well. So yeah, that's not really a question, but I don't know.
No. It makes me. I'm glad. People also other people are struggling with it. Maybe people are struggling with it, but they're putting up their own front about, this is what we're supposed to do. And I'm just like, but is it that cut and dry? Is it that black and white? Because I don't know that it is, and I have these other very concrete experiences of knowing that that's not what it is. Isn't it a very American thing? I don't know. So I'm sort of very constantly going back and forth with that. And people saying, did you have to see George Floyd to be what happened when he was murdered? Did you have to see that? And I said, I think so, because that had never happened before. And yeah, and people responded to that in a very concrete and a very profound way. And if they hadn't seen that, would they have responded the same way? And I don't think they would have. I don't know. I'm not really sure. So yeah, no, you're right. Interesting.
Again, I would say that like this is why I love Boal's methods, because like if you're doing a performance that's, provocative or potentially triggering, to either stop and do a forum, theater, or to have a post discussion, just in general, bringing that
Yeah,
intention of
yeah,
breaking down the barriers
yeah,
between
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
performers and the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
spectators, I
yeah,
think is so important,
yeah,
to hold that
yeah.
space of dialogue,
Right. Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah,
that,
yeah.
yeah.
And yeah, so and that's what we would do. We would stop at heightened moments, and then afterwards, this we would just shift in that we always did a post performance discussion, and then people could say what it was that bothered them, and we could have this discussion about, well, why, or what, or how could we have done this differently, or what did you need to see to be able to sort of come, to where you needed to be, and so yeah, again. Is sort of contrite as it sounds. I do think the discussion is valuable, you know, within within performance, within the and within arts in general. I do think that discussion is very valuable, to sort of understand some of these larger issues, because again, that's what it's supposed to be. It is supposed to be provocative, because what it's supposed to do is supposed to make you ask yourself something. So if I go in and if I go to see a piece of theater and I'm not asking myself something, then I don't know that I've really gone to see a piece of theater that was valuable. I need, I don't know, maybe I'm asking too much, but again, I think so, what's his name? Uh, Miranda. There's an issue with his film recently, in the Heights. So, there's like, like that many Black faces in there. And I don't mean African American, I mean Afro Latinos. And it's like Washington Heights, every other person looks like me, and some, and I'm just like, wait, how you gonna be in Washington Heights and not have every other person look like me? And there's enough discourse about the absence of Afro Latinos in narratives that he should have been aware of that. I'm like, how did he miss that discussion? So, again, his film is bringing up that discussion in a very larger context. I hear the discussion because I'm in those places and in those spaces here in DC, in particular, with folks from all over Latin America, Cubans, Colombians, Central Americans, just from all over the place. So I'm part of that discussion here. And there, it's a discussion that's growing. But Miranda is Hamilton, and everybody knows and loves Hamilton. And he had to like step back and say, okay, yeah, maybe I messed up here. So again, that he was not deliberately provocative. He was very short-sighted in what he did. But it does, even something as sort of something commercial like that has started that conversation again, and it started the conversation in a different kind of way, because it's opening up that conversation even more than it was, 2-3 months ago. So yeah, I guess all that to say that it needs to provoke something, and then we need time to sort of sort of talk back and have that discussion about what it provoked in me and why it provoked it, and why it provoked what it provoked in me, and why I was provoked that way, and what do we do next.
Is artistic value, do you find, is it subjective? Or do you think that there is like a high art of objective quality that we should work towards? And I think this is super meta, I know, but like, and I've kind of also been like questioning just like the objectivity of quality in general, but like specifically in the arts, how have you found, what have you found there?
I'm not sure. I do. I mean, I would like to go see a good performance. I want to be able to believe it. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that there's some value to that. And I think in part because, well, this is interesting. I think it's in part because there are a lot of folks out there who think that art doesn't really require any skills. And oh, y'all just messing around. You're just playing around here, you know. So I do think that if we're going to do our craft, we need to do it well. And not, you know, it's not just to say, you know, in your face, yeah, this is, but I do think that there's some value in that. You know, I've seen some really well-meaning stuff, but I'm just like, okay, yeah, y'all could have spent some more time rehearsing that, or you could have like gone through another 2 drafts of that script before you actually mounted this play. But yeah, you know, I suppose everything has a possibility, you know, some value in everything, some seed of value in all sorts of things. Um, but but at the same time, and you know, this is just sort of my personal bias about sort of like even commercial endeavors, mainstream endeavors. If we're not doing our work, then that's what you get. Um, and I think that as you know, as if you're doing work that, you know, sort of committing yourself to that work, then you're not selling for mainstream endeavors, and that, and you know, and I think that um, what, you know, what we bring to our craft, I think it will follow. Sort of, okay, I'm not willing to do mainstream stuff. I need to this to really resonate and people to like understand this in different kind of way. And that means pushing myself to like this whole other place, another, yeah, this means really means pushing myself to this whole other place. And I do think that when I'm pushing myself to that other place, then that sort of that 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 aesthetic quality.
I guess I've always kind of struggled with this question because I grew up going to Waldorf school, and
Okay.
but I think that now as a result of that, I felt and maybe this isn't supposed to be how you should feel as a result of Waldorf education, but I felt a real detachment from the world of logic, from
Mhm.
science.
Okay.
I felt like as an artist, I was not able to engage in more academic fields, right?
Okay.
And so that's been a big discovery for me recently, is just kind
Huh.
of recognizing art as a very academic tool,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
framework for things like uh, social justice and
Mhm.
different more yeah, slightly more rigid fields. But and I think also just like learning art is such a great framework for anything that you do,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it teaches you to deal with uncertainty, and it teaches you to be open to the mystery. And um, that's what makes that's what really draws me to art, is that
Yeah. Yeah.
unpredictability of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm very interested in doing more workshops, leading workshops that use Boal's theater techniques to facilitate discussions.
Mhm.
And I'm curious, just like what you would recommend to someone who's looking to pursue that, um, just like from your own experience of doing that sort of work.
I think that there's a mindfulness that comes to that. So I think that I try to be mindful of the fact that everybody's not a quote unquote artist, but everybody has the potential to create. Um, and um, for me, I think that um, that I think that that's kind of key. So yeah, just I guess perhaps maybe not underestimating what people's responses might be. Like I said, you know, I mentioned that performance where you had these very silly, very giggly, you know, 15-year-old boys, and you know, this, you know, the silliest and of them all has this very beautiful moment where he understands, you know, where he's like, the baby should talk to him and change this scenario. Um, I think, yeah, just being mindful of what the different experiences are that people bring to the, to bring as spectators, bring as audience members. And um, I have, I taught high school for a long time, for about 20 years, and I had students who were, I'm going to be a game designer. And I'm like, that's terrible, but sort of understanding that I do think that I don't play games and I don't, I'm not interested in them. And I don't like encourage people to do it because I think that they're like addictive in a crazy kind of way. But I'm also understanding as I begin to sort of see some of that stuff and understand that there's a certain aesthetic quality and a certain artistic value in that as well. I just think it needs to be sort of looked at and dealt with differently, but that's a different discussion. Um, so I think just sort of being, um, yeah, just sort of being mindful of what folks bring, and that, yeah, I think that that's probably the main thing because I think that that's the stuff that I do now, though not as frequently as I have done in the past is I've done I've done street theater with like children in Guatemala, and these are children who've never seen theater. They have no idea what, they're just like, we're just gonna go with it because we like you and we have fun with you, but we have no idea what's going on, because they've never had that opportunity. And it's like people walk through, we do street theater, people walk through the scenes and we'll be sitting in the scene having a discussion and somebody will come and sit next to them. It's like, I figure out a way to bring them in, ask him, well, did you see this? They're not quite sure how to respond to it. But the, um, but sort of despite that, sort of understanding that they haven't seen theater. This is a very it's a very new experience for them, but they do have the power to create, and that's what I think that that's what, in terms of what my so I guess kind of my thinking is that just sort of creating the space for that to happen, creating the space for being mindful of that and sort of creating the space for people um, to be able to have that and to be able to create. I think I don't know if that's an answer or not, but yeah, I don't know.
No, definitely. I guess I would also say that like my biggest fear going into that sort of work, and just also in general, like social justice work, is being a white male body and feeling like it's not my place to speak on these things,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a result of like the kind of liberal policing that exists, in liberal arts schools, and just kind of like I have observed like a real sort of like polarization in my classes of like when we talk about things like race and
Gender.
even though there is like a very strong incentive to, Prescott College has a lot more energy in it. There are schools that don't put in any effort
Yeah.
in terms of, things like critical race theory, and like at least we're putting in effort. But how can we do that in a way that's like more empowering? Because like at the end of my first year of college, I'm like, do I even want to like go into social justice? Like this
Right.
doesn't feel like it should be my voice.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because one of the things like whenever I hear, I'm always kind of, I don't know if I'm taken aback, but like, in my classes, and they're, these are classes that are about, I mean, they're, I guess they're marginally, well, no, not marginally. In some cases, I teach courses, like, well, I teach a literature course, it's Afro Black literature, and it's about Black people and our experiences, whatever. And people will sometimes say, well, white men and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay, yeah, whatever. But I don't ever say it, in part because part of what my thinking is that when I center you too much in my narrative, you get more control over me than you deserve. So I'm just like, oh, y'all want to talk about that? Do go for it. I'm not, I'm bringing you what I know. I mean, I don't understand. I don't know that experience. I know sort of historically, I can give you the historical context of things and I give you the actual history of things. But in terms of me sort of, sort of beyond that, I don't spend a lot of time dwelling on, the man has done this and the man has done that. Cause I mean, yeah, it was done. Okay. Yeah. And it's not like, let's move on. That's not what I'm saying. But what I do think is that when I give you that much power, like I said, when I center you too much in my narrative, then you start taking away my power. And I'm not going to allow you to do that. So I do think that all of us, and this has come up, and I feel like people are talking about this more, and I've been telling people this for years. It's not my job to teach you about racism. Y'all need to talk to your families. The every year at Thanksgiving, you see these things about those difficult conversations at Thanksgiving dinner. That it's like people are, I'm going to go home and have those difficult conversations. Have those difficult conversations, because that's y'all. Y'all need to fix your own, just like I need to fix my own. So, all of my work has really been about fixing my own. And sort of, because there's a lot of damage that's been done. There's damage that you all don't understand. Um, and that we need to dig in and start, like, figuring it out. And that doesn't involve you. And yeah, I mean, and I don't want to, I'm not being dismissive, but it just doesn't involve you. But there's a piece of that does involve you, and there's a piece of that uh, that I challenge you, and I'm actually saying this to you. I challenge you to say, what piece of that do I need to talk about, and what piece of that do I need to begin to address? So yeah, going back to your question, uh, your previous question about advice, my advice to you is that, to begin to figure out a way to sort of open those spaces for that conversation that you're able to have. Um, I don't, there's things it's not part of your experience. So why even try to like approach them? But there are things that are part of your experience that will get us closer to where we need to be. So look at those things and address those things and create those things in your work. I end up talking a lot about ancestors in some of my courses. And who are your ancestors? And some people, it's like, and I actually mean it like sort of directly, who are the people that, on whose shoulders am I standing? Who are the people that kind of like, pulled me along? The literary ancestors, and the other artists. I have a lot of artistic ancestors who are not part of my lineage. And these are the people whose voices that have, like, changed me. Freire is one of them. Boal is one of them. James Baldwin, any number of different people who in Water Galliano. So these are the people who have like fed me. And then I have my own ancestors. So there's one course where I teach them. Just to tell you, I tell stories, and you're going to know about my grandparents, and you're going to know about my parents, and you're going to know about my, in-laws, because they bring something very important to this particular discussion that we're having here. And I had a student last year who comes from an old shipping family, very, very colonial, very WAS upper, and I was like, and he told me, he was like, yeah, my family owns this shipping company up in Maine. I was like, oh, interesting. And we talked about it, and I said, well, those are your ancestors, that's your lineage. She said, yeah, I don't know about claiming those colonial lineages or not. And I get that. I understand that, but you have to, because um, uh, part of your contribution to quote unquote social justice is you confronting that. And if you can't like claim it, then you can't confront it. So I would encourage you and challenge you to confront and to claim those things, and be willing to confront them, and be willing to confront them with others as well who share that ancestry, and then very specific ancestry that you mentioned, sort of your own sort of fear and your own sort of reluctance in some ways to address some of this stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where performance and autoethnography have been super helpful for me to sort of feel comfortable to confront these issues and to step into the conversation. to help understand intersection in identity
Yeah,
between,
yeah, yeah.
that, my family from my mom and dad's side, very different, Jewish socialists on my dad's side, Roman Catholic conservatives on my mom's side, just very, very a lot of intersection that you don't see.
Hmm, hmm.
And I think that's been super informative for me, just moving forward with this kind of work.
Hmm.
To yeah, look at ancestry and look at your history.
Yeah, yeah. Our
Yeah.
histories are so important. And I'm hearing that. I mean, like right now in particular, where people are just like, nope, that never happened. We're not going to talk about that. How do we not talk about that? How do we not talk about our own, our history? How do we not talk about, sort of our individual histories? And how do we not talk about like sort of these larger histories? How do you do that? I just, I'm just befuddled. I'm just, how does that, yeah, how do they even like, yeah, how do you do that? Yeah. So particularly right now, sort of understanding how valuable that is really important.
I guess kind of like touching on that topic, I'm curious, just like from your own experience of doing this work, how you have overcome fear um, in art making, with art making, just like throughout that process. What has that been like for you?
So when I started doing theater in high school, um, as I mentioned, this was a very, this was like, we did very traditional theater. Um, and Thornton Wilder and, Anton Chekhov and, Come Back Little Sheba and, sort of these interesting plays from the 50s and 60s. And I was not, my very existence wasn't even part of those plays. And some of my teachers were really embraced who I was, and then some of them dismissed me because I didn't fit what they thought an actor should look like, and that was very palpable. I had one teacher in particular who only he would kind of um, he was always, the very light skinned girls. He would like, these were his darlings, and he would give them all the best plays and all this other stuff. So my first experience with theater was actually one where I didn't feel like had any value at all. Um, and I think when I had that opportunity to create people who looked like me and talked like me, and and were kind of raggedy like me, but also kind of brilliant like me, and just then I was able to sort of overcome that fear, because there was a part of me that didn't even want to continue, because I didn't think that I fit the mold of what I'm supposed to look like. And you still see that today. I'm just like, well, damn, why do the women always look like this? Or why do the men always look like it? Whether these particular two people together, there has, the man will be dark and the woman will be very light. It's like, well, wow, why do women like me don't have a place in here? So for me, it really was that theater that allowed me to embrace my identity, that allowed me to overcome that fear, I think. So yeah, sort of thinking about your own work, I think as you begin to as your creativity allows you to embrace those identities, you'll become more and more comfortable with saying, okay, yeah, I like this. I like who this person is. I like what this person produces. I like what I'm seeing here. So I'm gonna like allow myself to share that more. And I'm actually, I sing. And that was the thing that I always wanted to do, was sing, but I never felt comfortable doing it. So, the um, uh, that was the one area that like I had this other talent, this other skill, and I could never quite overcome that fear. But I do feel like perhaps now that I'm older, I can overcome that fear. But yeah, I do think that, at least for me, that fear though really came from me being able to feel like my identity had an importance there, and that I was able to like claim that person and celebrate that person um, in the ways that I wanted to, and that allowed me to sort of overcome the other pieces of the things that I was afraid of, I think.
What do you hope to see for the future of arts, performing arts, and that could be like within your own life or in the bigger sense of just the world?
Yeah, the last I was born and raised here in DC, but like Guatemala is really home now. So what I would like to see is that I do some work with a theater, not a theater, a dance group in Guatemala, the town where I live. And these are young people that have, they're all of these, I don't even know how would, let me see, how would you describe them? I think the term would be, I think the term would be something like ritual dances or dance theaters. And these are not, they're not dance in the sense that we're talking like Ailey or something like that. They're dance in the sense that they are these dances that have been around for like 1,000 years, and these are dance dramas that were performed in communities and in villages, starting before the colonial era and then changing some in the colonial era. And what this group does, Nawal Winach, is that um, they've taken to recreating some of these dance dramas that have disappeared, and they need a home. And I'm just like, wow, we really need like a real cultural center in our town where people are doing all sorts of art. And they, now the dance group would have they'd have their space, and we do more street theater to call attention to like the political situation in the country and blah, 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 blah. So that sort of in my own life, that's what I would like to see. Could happen. We'll see. I'm trying to get Prescott College on. Roque Dalton is a Salvadoran poet. He's been dead for a number of years now. He has this poem, which I can't remember the name of it. Como tú, like you. I like you, love, love. And there's this poem about, there's this line about, I think the world is beautiful and that poetry like bread is for everyone. And I think that that's what I want people to, I guess that's what I want to be able to see, is like sort of going back to some of the things that I said earlier, that everybody's not necessarily, doesn't have to be an artist and not necessarily an artist, but everybody has the possibility to create. And I want folks to understand that. And I want folks to understand that I just feel like there's got to be this great reimagining that happens. And we can reimagine if we can't think about things differently. We can't reimagine if we can't create. So that reimagining will have to happen through a process of creation. And we really need to recreate this world in a way that is equitable. We need to create this world in a way that is safe for all of us. And then we need to, like, all of that has to happen. But if we can't like imagine it, we can't reimagine it, then we're stuck. And I do think that allowing people to have that opportunity to explore theater and dance and music, I think that there's a lot of possibilities through that recreation that needs to happen, that creation that needs to happen, so that reimagining will happen. The poetry like bread is for everyone. I think that's that. I think that that's kind of the most important thing, is that everybody can be a part of this process, and everybody brings something to this process, and the possibilities of them bringing something to this process are pretty great and pretty profound. So, yeah. Tell me what you are. So this is an independent study. So what are you doing with these interviews? I guess that's what I want to know.
Yeah. So with consent of the interviewee, I post some of them on my podcast.
Okay.
Also, but mainly what I'm doing is I re-listen, I take notes, and I write about art. So that's kind of been like the big part of the course. And then there's also like a more creative component as well, where I'll be doing I'm working on a mural right now on campus, and that's part of it. And then I might do a performance at the end of the summer as well, something. So, but yeah, the interviews have been sort of just like data for my own like self-reflection, as well as working to redevelop kind of a performing arts department at Prescott College.
Yeah.
This is, yeah, I'm doing these interviews to demonstrate that people are talking about this, that there are very creative students at Prescott College that, and some of them are very confident at being self-directed in immersing themselves in arts, while others need that underlying structure from professors, from the school to really dive into that. So I think it's very important, especially at a school that, you know, emphasizes social justice, to have that paired with, because I found for myself, like getting over so much fear through performance work to then engage with social justice. So yeah, that's been a big incentive, doing the work that I'm doing. And yeah, and again, just kind of in terms of my degree path, really, I mean, Boal is just like such a huge inspiration to me. I want to do what he did. I mean, I can't really do what he did, but I will attempt to. And yeah, that's, and again, yeah, just, I feel like it's funny, you know, I came to college thinking, I took a couple gap years and thought I wanted to get into environmental science, sustainability, you know, which I'm still interested in. You know, I'm an interdisciplinary major now, so I can still tie all those things together. But I'm realizing, you know, that art and performance really is like the center for me, that the glue that brings everything together. So, which is, you know, I thought, I'm not going to do art. I'm not going to do performance. I come from a family of artists. So I'm like, I'm going to break the cycle. I'm going to do something different. But here we are coming full circle. So it's like, that's what happened. So yeah.
No, that's great. That's good to hear. I've had, this is my fourth year at the college. I think I'm coming into my fourth year. And my first year, I had a couple of students who were like, no, yeah, when I first got here, they were like, the art department was shutting down,
Yep.
you know, disappearing. So that, you know, that was unfortunate. And I do think that, but yeah, that needs to be part of this as well. Because again, there's a lot of stuff in there, you know, that, you know, we do a lot of, we would do street theater here in the city about, you know, housing displacement and gentrification. And in the course of the performance, you'd find out, where do I go, what the phone number is, and all this other stuff. So, you know, just sort of very, you know, sort of very nuts and bolts educational way. These are the things that are happening. And when we were doing like AIDS education work, is that, you know, I may not, you know, somebody in this performance may not go into a clinic because they're too scared, but if I can get you that information on the street in the street theater piece, then yeah, then I, you know, I've done what I needed to do. So
Right.
So yeah, I do think that there's a lot of yeah, that the school really should have that, and sort of understanding that. You know, I've been pushing this in our department and CRS for, you know, a couple of years, but I don't think people get it. But but again, if you don't know it, so if you can't talk about the Mexican Revolution or the Cuban Revolution or even the Sandinista Revolution without talking about art, because art was really central to all of that stuff, you know.
Yeah.
You know, after the Cuban Revolution, you know, Cuba has put so much like emphasis on filmmaking and theater and creative writing and all this other stuff, and that was like central to the revolution. Same thing in Nicaragua, same thing in Mexico, and Dio Rivera and all those other folks. They were like painting the history of Mexico on walls for primarily for a population of people who never learned to read and write. So you can read this book, but I can definitely see this history of Mexico on this wall and understand this history of Mexico. So I think that with my colleagues, just because they didn't have the same experience, that I don't think, you know, like I remember bringing it up and saying, oh, we're doing some of that and something. And I was like, yeah, but I don't think you get it. And I don't think people got sort of, I think you mentioned it a little while ago. I don't think people got the the quote unquote, the intellectual piece
Mm.
that is very much a part of it, that is really there. I think that, I don't think that folks really understood that there's like this long history of artists being very involved politically. Pablo Neruda, Edwige Dedekind. You have these writers and these other artists who are at the vanguard of speaking truth to power, and they're doing it through their literature, and they're doing it through their writing, and they're doing it through their art. Um, and I guess if you haven't had that experience, you don't quite grasp what the possibilities are. And that's unfortunate because I recognize the possibility, and I run into students who recognize the possibilities as well, but don't have a community to have that conversation and really sort of dig in, um, and to have really sort of take that on in a really like solid and profound way. So I'm very excited to hear that. That's exciting. That's great.